originally started with me and Dre. I did this music video for him and Eminem called "I Need a Doctor." That's where that Ferrari flip came from, actually. And it was a video about Eminem talking shit for like 2 verses, like, "Dre, get up, where are you? Coming back and make music." I never heard anything like that. And I turned it kind of, the whole music video, into a career retrospective. And at that moment, I realized, like, wow, this was 8 years ago. I'm like, this guy's lived the life of 10 men. And we basically agreed that we would try to figure out how to do his life story. This is before Straight Outta Compton. And I decided to, it's way before. And I decided to call HBO, who financed it, and pitch it to him over the phone, pitched it. I said, what if I told you I can get the most enigmatic hip hop artist of all time to open up about his life? They said, who? I said, Dr. Dre. They said, green light. I never heard green light in a room, nonetheless over the phone. Green light, we got one problem. What's that? We just greenlit a documentary on Interscope Records with Jimmy. I said, I'll call you right back. Because right then I went, because I've known both of them for over 25 years. And I know that partnership, not as much as I learned during the film, don't get me wrong, but I knew then, I was like, wow, that would be an even more incredible story, you know? Yeah, I'm a big fan of this documentary called The Battle Over Citizen Kane, which is about William Randolph Hearst and Orson Welles. And both child prodigies, both doted on by their mothers, and then their parallel stories, even though they're different ages, like Jimmy and Dre, but they destroyed each other over that film, Citizen Kane. And there's a remarkable PBS documentary. So I had that in my head. I'm like, wow, if I can take that, and then they don't destroy each other, they kind of create this win, that'd be extraordinary, but easier said than done. It was very difficult to do it, you know. Well, he was coming up on 50 when we started having these discussions. And when we were making a documentary, he was 49, turning 50. And most artists at that point, they slow down a little bit and go, I wonder what this is all about. And I think Dre was curious. For the first time in his life, he was curious about his past. He was never curious before, trust me. And Jimmy certainly wasn't about his. So that's what really happened, is Dre was inspiring me through his curiosity, because he doesn't even know what year he did something. He's bad at years. He's bad at when and why and how, because he never looks back. Him and Jimmy, they have like blinders on, forward thinking. So it was interesting and dynamic, because I don't know who was the therapist and who was the patient a lot of times. Yeah. So it felt like that with Jimmy and Dre the whole time. Like sometimes I was stretched out on the couch getting advice, and most of the time they were stretched out not getting advice, just me going, and how'd that make you feel? You know, that's by the way, that's the benefit of a film director doing a documentary and knowing to go, all right, let's bring the powers of cinema into this medium that mostly has been industrial type, you know, for lack of a better word, and talking heads. And also cueing into, you know, I'm making a movie about a world-class DJ, producer, and Dr. Dre, and you got to move the crowd, you know, you got to mix this shit so you're focused, you know. And I would take, you know, as I was making it, I'd have 5-minute scenes here, 20-minute scenes there. I would show you guys if I knew you, and I'd show my mother and her friends and these millennials. So I was in the room and I was able to kind of feel what was sucking people in or not, you know, just really paying attention to that, you know. Because I think a lot of people in the arts too, they start playing for themselves, like they're jazz musicians, independent filmmakers, like, oh, all right, let me just do this and do that. And you're like, this is about the audience. Like if they're not pulling them in, why are you making film? And I think a lot of my peers, not a lot of them, but some of them, some people before me, some people after me, they get caught up in this artsy, let me show the audience what they need to see right now. And you can do both. But I think the most important thing, and it's what Hitchcock always talked about, is you're making this for a cinema of 2,000 seats back in his day, not one. You know, and always pay attention to, and that DJ thing again, I was baselining the whole narrative off of my 2 subjects, who they are and what they do. And hip hop. Hip hop swallows up everything in its path as far as culture, and takes it and puts it back out in new and inventive ways that rock can't do, country can't do, jazz can't do. Hip hop can do all. Yes. I think the better way to describe it is hip hop will mutate always. A left, right, front, center, back, and grow. And no other form of even business can mutate that way. So you got this black guy and this white guy, as they say, from racially charged neighborhoods. There were no white people where Dre's from. There were no black people where Jimmy's from. And see that partnership come together. But what really made it work was not just the magic of the two guys, it was hip hop. And I'm not no hip hop, like, oh, hip hop's everything, is, because rock is great too. But because of the nature of hip hop and how it can mutate is what made it magic, I'll defer to Bono, and it didn't make it in the movie. When he said hip hop is global more so than rock, I said, how? He goes, because I can go to Africa right now and they know who Tupac is and they know that beat and they never heard of me. And I work a lot in Africa, he says. For Bono to say that, and he does a lot of philanthropic stuff in Africa, He said another thing is quite interesting, and I wish I can quote him verbatim. He says, it occurs to me that rock is a genre that's all about guys with mommy issues, all the way through Robert Johnson and blues, mommy issues. He said hip hop uniquely is guys with daddy issues. And I got goosebumps, and I was like, whoa. He goes, that's what makes it, not makes it, he goes, that's what's different about that music. And I was like, wow, that's deep. And if you look at, one of the things me and Tupac connected over, it was never said, but it was the undercurrent. It was crazy daddy issues. You don't have a Tupac without daddy issues. We all have mommy issues. You know what I mean? Yeah. That just comes with, right? Yeah. Tupac, that manic, charismatic, crazy energy is searching for a daddy. I mean, when I look at it, I didn't realize it, but it's in the DNA of the very film. I'm baselining off of Jimmy and Dre in making the film, and I'm a director, and in the film business, the director is the record producer. Obviously not the star, mostly not the writer. So you're essentially, that's where me and Dre connect, is that I look at Dre like a fellow director, and sometimes he'll look at me like a fellow producer, sometimes. So, it was baked in, I think, that producerial record producer approach to filmmaking and celebrating those guys and gals and engineers and mixers and whatever. Even though we didn't get into the details of all that stuff, because I remember watching a documentary when I was going into this, like, oh, we can't get into the weeds of all this shit. You've got to make it fun, like where anyone can understand what it's like to work in the studio, and that was the approach. Yeah. The history of hip hop. I find it, one thing we do in a culture when we're writing or we're producing something is we all are very ambitious and we want to tell the story of hip hop. We want to tell the story of slavery, whatever the fuck it is, right? And you don't realize, like, the best way to do it is to go, I'm going to take your story. You're a hip hop artist, and I'm going to tell your story, and somehow it'll interweave into the. So Dre, you see when he's in the opening part, he's on the island. And ironically, you come into Dre, he's rocking out the Nirvana of all things, which I'm like, this is odd, right? And you go from one white group to another one when he starts playing Kraftwerk, the German group that Trans Euro Express was hip hop, that he starts talking about the melody that was hip hop was basically based on, which is an interesting thing, approach that I was taking in the film, which is black is white and white is black. Because I'm biracial. I didn't do it on purpose. It just naturally came out. Like, some of what hip hop was born out of was a German white group. That's odd, but it's true, But my point is that was our foundation, and that because that's personal to Dre. Right. If we were interviewing Rakim, it would have been a different story. Yeah. So you continue, and then he becomes a DJ in LA, and you hear that whole sound and you hear the. Hip hop, whether it was New York, LA, Brixton, there was certain sounds that were happening that were similar in all those cities, And because I kept it focused on the individual, it was a simpler equation and it was more emotional. That's the point. It's more emotional. what am I doing in this medium? I'm a guy from cinema. Why am I going to just come and just set the, first of all, you got the greatest artists of all time, some of the greatest music of all time, telling the greatest stories that I never heard of all time. So I'm just going to sit there and just let the camera just sit there like most people would. I go, nah, I got to get involved. Because your ego, your ego comes out a little bit. You're like, no, I can compete at this level. But you, moreover than the ego, you go, I got to keep people engaged. And my mom gets bored easy. And I had a rule in the editing room. If grandma don't understand it, it's got to go. So anytime any of those stories in the film, I had this grandma thing I'd click on in my head and I go, no, grandma don't understand this. You guys got to do more work. I don't feel it. And that was the other thing. It's have feeling. Because there were plenty of academic scenes that were just genius. Because my editors were off the charts brilliant. But I'm like, this is academic. I don't, And, who was that great filmmaker, Werner Herzog, the documentary maker. He said cinema is not about academics have no passion. Cinema is the language of illiterates, and there's no one more illiterate than me. And I didn't realize that. Like, wow, cinema was created. It's not an academic thing. The passion comes from feeling. Artists are all about feeling, I didn't know that. Yeah. No, I think I'm doing what I do when I direct a movie is, you're baselining off of your performer. And Jimmy, his art is business. And Jimmy's an artist. I don't know how many people pick up on that. Yeah. And it's an art what he does. And he's very emotional, but he never lets emotion get in the way of the bigger picture. So I didn't know that going in. I'm talking about that point you're making about the business and how, and by the way, as the shit's getting more successful, not just rock music, obviously hip hop, as it's blowing up, it's becoming more of a business. As CDs start getting pressed, as it illustrated in the film, this is becoming, we went from records and 8-tracks to cassette tapes to CDs, which were cheaper than all of that to produce. So the margins, so you're following the money. And literally, you're following the money. I didn't have to make that up. I didn't even know that. I had no idea all that I just told you before I went into making the film. So all that, going back to the ego, you actually got to not have an ego because you'll be so dogmatic about what you're trying to do or what you initially put on paper. And I was not dogmatic about most of the things in the film. A lot of things I knew personally, whether it was Eazy-E, my first mentor when I was 19, or Tupac, one of the first great artists I worked with on his first album, on to Marilyn Manson, who I know very well. I can keep going on. I only got dogmatic about my editor, one of my young editors, excuse me. He get arrogant sometimes because he's a hip hop head and he's a theorist too. This is what happened and this is why Death Row and Tupac. No, I'm telling you, I'm saying, motherfucker, I was there. That's the only way I can end the argument. No, I was there. That's not what happened. You're very passionate, and you're actually quite a genius. You've done a lot, but no.
Not on this point.
Wow, that's fine. Oh, it's happening. There's a lot of these independent artists that are turning down big deals because they've carved out, the Midwest already. Or they carved out the South, and they're making. They see their money they're making. I mean, there's so many stories. The names escape me right now because I don't even know who half these motherfuckers are, right? But they're turning down big record deals because they're seeing the money themselves and they're in direct contact with their fans. And they see where to move and how to grow it. That's going on big time in the States right now. And places that never counted before, like the Midwest, again, Cleveland. You hear of these artists, you're like, what the hell? That's going down big time right now. I wish I can rattle off a name of artists, but shit.
It kind of leaves it's like an.
You're a producer, business person, which Eazy started too. Eazy-E, he was an artist who didn't know he was an artist. Yeah. Business person, businessman, And the thing that Jimmy, when you look at the film, I think can teach all of us is like he made the adjustments along the way. So you can't just be just purely passionate about the music. You gotta also go, what's happening in culture? Shit's changing. I gotta adapt. And most people don't, what's that saying, adapt or die? Most people can't adapt. Most artists can adapt, most businessmen can adapt. You know, and that's what the X factor is, those that can. Look at Dre. Dre's 53 years old. And you go, how the hell did he start 84 with this shit? And he had the purple satin period. And yeah, I mean, between him and Easy, they understood the alchemy of what was going to cut through. All right, let's talk enough shit and make it sound hot. It's period, right? It's going to cut through. It's going to cut through. For me, is like what Jimmy said with the blinders. Get those blinders on, especially in this era of social media, which I just got off of before I got over here, which is the opposite of blinders. Focus. Like, find out what your passion is as early as you can, and then tune everything out. And if you're really meant for it, just doing that is. When Jimmy was at Interscope, you think he was listening to other music? No one. This is not in a film. No. He didn't know one record that came out in that era. Only records he knew that were out were his records. Now he had other staff that paid attention to all that shit. So he was hyper efficient and focused, and I think that's the biggest thing as a person, as a filmmaker, that I've taken away from this process is going, man, you know, sometimes I would get too emotional with things or get caught up in people's nonsense. And now I'm like hyper focused on what I do and achieving it, you know, and I can write an encyclopedia on the rest of the shit that literally that I took away from this thing. Because you can imagine each artist I sat down with, I averaged 3.5 hours with them. Wow. And maybe 15 minutes of footage was used in the film.